The 9th century, the shore of a harsh Norwegian fjord. A young, unknown konung sends envoys to the daughter of a neighboring ruler, offering her to become his wife. In response, the girl publicly mocks his status, declaring that she will never tie her fate to the chieftain of a pathetic patch of land. Hearing this rejection, the young man does not draw his sword. He makes an extravagant, almost insane vow. He refuses to cut or comb his hair until he has subjected the entirety of Norway. It sounds like the setup for a naive romantic saga, but in reality, this youthful pride triggered the mechanism of the most terrifying demographic catastrophe in Northern Europe. Official chronicles have for centuries celebrated this man as Harald Fairhair, the genius unifier and noble first king of Norway. The epic paints a monarch who halted the chaos of fragmentation, but this ceremonial portrait is the greatest historical illusion. In reality, Harald's power was built on total terror. Having cobbled together an army, he marched through independent lands with fire, burning down ancient estates and levying exorbitant taxes on the survivors. The ruler did the unthinkable. He abolished the Scandinavian sacred right to ancestral land, declaring an entire country his personal property. Fleeing his dictatorship, the flower of the nation, powerful chieftains, the best navigators, and fearless warriors left their homeland forever. Today, you will learn why the triumph of one king provoked the Great Exodus, sending Ingólfr Arnarson to lay the foundation of Iceland and the mighty Rollo to storm the stone walls of Paris. How a radical shift in the rules of war and the abolition of ancient laws broke the backs of independent northern chieftains. What role the Ofhednar, fanatical warriors in wolfskins who threw themselves at enemy spears without a shadow of fear, played in the decisive naval meat grinder at Hafrsfjord, and how the monarch who single-handedly plunged his numerous sons into a fratricidal bloodbath at the twilight of his life. We will not philosophize about the lofty concepts of state building. Before you will unfold a grim chronicle of absolute power, woven from the ash of burned ships, confiscated fields, and broken human destinies. Fleeing Harald's punitive squads, settlers rushed to meet the icy hell, laying the foundation of a free Iceland, and defiant jarls preferred the status of exiles, later founding a mighty Normandy and redrawing the map of Europe. And this teaches us the most important rule of history. A crown forged from fear and the deprivation of freedoms inevitably devours its own creators. The 9th century. Northern Europe resembles a patchwork quilt of hundreds of independent domains. The Scandinavia of that time rejects the very idea of a unified state. The land, carved by deep fjords, dictates its own harsh rules. Every bay is, in essence, a separate, sovereign kingdom. Dozens of petty konungs and jarls rule over their patches of land, relying exclusively on the clash of swords and the decisions of the local thing. Free farmers, the bondes, decide for themselves which chieftain to follow on the spring raid. Within this primal chaos, the destinies of future legends are being forged, while somewhere in the west, the stubborn navigator Floki is cursing the icy wasteland he discovered, and the young Ingólfr Arnarson is just getting drawn into the destructive spiral of a blood feud. A political storm is rapidly brewing in the south of Norway. This coming tempest will soon hurl them all across the ocean, including the young giant Rollo, who doesn't even suspect that the crown of Normandy awaits him in the future. At the epicenter of the impending catastrophe is Vestfold, a strategically vital and wealthy coastal province. It is ruled by the ancient house of Yngling. They stand a step above your average pirates. The influence of this dynasty is measured by the colossal burial mounds at Borre and Oseberg. Beneath the massive earthen vaults of these tombs lie 20-meter-long ships stuffed with Byzantine silks, gold, and sacrificed steeds. The Ynglings possess significant resources, but they are desperately lacking the most important thing: dominion over their defiant neighbors. The young ruler of Vestfold, Harald, has inherited the ambitions of his mighty ancestors. In his youth, he decides to secure his political status through a tried-and-true maneuver, a dynastic marriage. His choice falls upon Gyda, the daughter of the king of neighboring Hordaland. The girl is famous not only for her beauty, but also for her exorbitant pride. Harald's envoys arrive at her estate with rich gifts, expecting a submissive agreement. However, the routine matchmaking turns into a public insult. Gyda rejects the gifts with undisguised contempt. She strikes at the most vulnerable spot of a Scandinavian chieftain, his political weight. The chronicles have passed down her mockery, as sharp as the blade of an axe. I will not tie my fate to a petty jarl whose domains are but a couple of pathetic fjords. Come back when your master has subjugated all of Norway. Then we will talk. For a warrior of the Viking Age, such a response is tantamount to an immediate declaration of war. The code of honor demanded that the insulted konung gather his hird, burn the insolent estate to the ground, and take the woman as a lawful spoil of war. But Harald acts contrary to all the traditions of his cruel century. Having listened to the envoys, pale with fear, he utters the words that triggered the mechanism of the greatest demographic catastrophe in Northern Europe. The ruler makes an extravagant and terrifying vow. He refuses to cut or comb his hair until he becomes the sole monarch of a unified country. Thus, Harald Lufa, Tanglehair, appears on the historical stage. The young konung sincerely believed that such an oath would demonstrate his unbreakable will and strike terror into his enemies. But in the harsh reality of the North, the overgrown, tangled chieftain initially evoked only blatant contempt. Proud sea kings openly mocked their neighbor, considering him a madman who traded martial honor for a ridiculous whim. The true irony, however, lay in the future. It was precisely these louse-infested, tangled locks that would soon become the most terrifying symbol of a new era. They would become the banner of a bloody steamroller that would crush centuries-old freedoms and flood the icy waters of the fjords with the blood of those very mockers. The tangled hair of Harald Tanglehair became the countdown timer for all of free Scandinavia. The young man perfectly understood. To force dozens of experienced sea wolves into submission, merely cobbling together a large army was not enough. To win this impossible campaign, Harald needed to radically rewrite the very rules of warfare. He had to abandon the status of first among equals and transform into an absolute dictator. But how exactly did an ambitious ruler turn his troops into a machine of total terror, permanently abolishing the very concept of the right to one's native land? For long centuries, Scandinavia lived in a predictable rhythm of violence. The traditional Viking raid followed a clear logic of enrichment. A chieftain gathered men, attacked weak neighbors or foreign shores, took gold and slaves, and returned to celebrate in his hall. War remained a means of quick enrichment, but by no means an instrument of long-term occupation. However, Harald Tanglehair shatters this ancient algorithm. He completely abandons the classic seasonal raids for easy loot. The young ruler is no longer looking for someone else's silver. He comes to take the land itself. Moving out from his native Vestfold, the royal herd methodically advances north and west. Their tactics are striking in their ruthless pragmatism. If a local konung refuses to bend the knee, Harald does not merely limit himself to killing the defiant leader in fair combat. His punitive detachments put ancient estates to the torch, mercilessly scorching entire valleys. Now imagine, thick black smoke obscures the crystal-clear air of the Norwegian fjords, settling as heavy ash on the icy cliffs. The locals, fleeing the roaring flames, are forced to escape into the mountains, abandoning the property accumulated over generations. But the true horror lay not in the fire, but in the new laws. To definitively break the will of the people, Harald commits a sacrilege unthinkable for the freedom-loving North. He abolishes the sacred right of the odal. The odal itself is not just an agricultural allotment. It is an inalienable ancestral territory, watered by the sweat and blood of forefathers. Owning land made a Scandinavian a free man, granting him a voice at the thing and personal dignity. And now, with one ruthless decree, Harald declares absolutely all the territory of Norway his own personal property. Consider the scale of this social catastrophe. It is equivalent to the government today suddenly confiscating all private real estate in the country, forcing citizens to pay exorbitant rent for the right to sleep in their own bedrooms. The proud, free, bondy farmers were transformed overnight into disenfranchised tenant farmers. From then on, they were obligated to pay the king a harsh land tax. The slightest delay or resistance was punished by the immediate confiscation of their last crumbs of property and death. To maintain this chilling order, Harald builds an unprecedentedly rigid vertical chain of power. In each conquered district, the monarch appoints a loyal jarl, his viceroy, who collects taxes and dispenses justice. Under the command of the jarls stand the hersers, overseeing the execution of the crown's will. The ancient democracy of free chiefdoms is torn out by the roots, giving way to a ruthless machine of tax administration. The ruler sincerely believed that he was forging a great, civilized power, uniting tribal chaos under the firm hand of the law. But in reality, his progress turned into the total robbery of his own people. The man who wanted to become a noble monarch became the most ruthless occupier of his native land. Every new victory only multiplied a sullen, hidden hatred. The fiery steamroller brought Harald colossal wealth and new territories, but simultaneously backed his enemies into a corner. The surviving sea kings and proud rulers of the southern fjords perfectly understood the inevitable. If they continued to sit behind their wooden palisades, the tangle-haired tyrant would sooner or later burn them down, one by one. A preemptive strike was required, one capable of cutting off the head of this growing leviathan. Setting aside old feuds, the independent chieftains unite. Dozens of rulers muster hundreds of warships into a massive armada to trap and permanently drown Harald in the narrow waters of Hafrsfjord. The rebel konings believed that their overwhelming numerical superiority guaranteed them an easy victory over the usurper. However, the conspirators had no idea that on the bows of the royal longships, an encounter with a living nightmare awaited them. Standing there were fanatics in wolfskins, ready to laugh in the face of death and tear their enemies apart with their bare hands. The end of the 9th century. The waters of Hafrsfjord in southwestern Norway darken with hundreds of oak keels. The independent rulers of the south and west have amassed a colossal armada here. They had no doubt that their overwhelming numerical superiority would snap the trap shut, and they hoped to permanently drown the usurper in the cold waves. In reality, however, the coalition's combined fleet was sailing straight into a catastrophe of its own making. The fjord they had chosen as a mass grave for the tyrant transformed into the baptismal font of his absolute empire. The fate of all free Scandinavia depended on the outcome of this confrontation. In Hafrsfjord itself, the roar of thousands of throats drowned out the crashing of the surf. Hundreds of warships were relentlessly closing in. Harald Fairhair stood motionless on the deck of his flagship. His fingers dug with a death grip into the scarred hilt of his sword, and his tangled locks whipped across his face, turning the young chieftain into the living embodiment of primal fury. Viking naval battles were fundamentally different from the ancient naval engagements we are used to. Ships did not ram each other. Long ships closed the distance, and the warriors lashed them tightly together, side to side, with heavy ropes. The sea turned into a colossal wooden platform. Essentially, a brutal land battle unfolded over the abyss. There was nowhere to retreat. One wrong move, and heavy chainmail would drag you to the bottom more certainly than an enemy spear. It is in this dense, blood-choked crush that Harald plays his ultimate trump card. Gripping axes on the prows of the royal ships were not just veterans, but Ulfhednar, fanatics in wolfskins. These fighters entered a state of battle trance, felt no pain, and refused to use shields. Biting into the enemy formation, they literally hewed clearings through the ranks of the rebels, and their bestial howling paralyzed even the most experienced seafarers. The price of this triumph turned out to be monstrous. Thousands of men perished in this slaughter, more than the entire population of the future colony that Ingólfr Arnarson was soon to found in icy Iceland. Here, in the crimson waters of Hafrsfjord, bled the fathers of those warriors who would later set out with the mighty Rollo to storm the stone walls of Paris. The independent konungs fell beneath the blows of the royal guard, one after another. The survivors threw themselves overboard, preferring death by suffocation to facing the wolfskins. Harald Fairhair forged his kingdom with the strikes of an axe, utterly crushing the coalition. From now on, the entire Norway, Nordveg, lay at his feet. The enemies are destroyed, the rivals are dead, and the victor's youthful vow is finally fulfilled. The mutilated country fell silent under the heel of the dictator. But the triumph brought an unforeseen threat. The surviving free Bondis faced a brutal choice: bow their heads to the new taxes or risk everything. They took a step that redrew the map of Europe. At that moment, Harald did not yet realize that with his own hands he was triggering the mechanism of the Great Exodus, giving birth to flotillas of avengers and armies of exiles. The waters of Hafrsfjord swallowed the last of the enemies. The wreckage of hundreds of longships washed ashore, while the defiant jarls either fed the fishes or left their native fjords forever. The 10-year war ended in the total victory of a single man. The vow made by an insulted youth had finally been fulfilled. Norway lay at his feet, shackled by fear and drenched in blood. The time had come to remember the woman whose mockery had set this destructive steamroller into motion. The victor summons the proud Gyda to him, the princess who had once rejected the petty chieftain. She enters into a lawful marriage with him. However, no fairy tale ending occurs. Over the years of endless butchery, the romantic impulse had long since burned out, giving way to cold pragmatism. Gyda ends up being just one of the monarch's many wives, a political trophy in the growing harem of the new overlord. The naive matchmaking birthed not a great love, but a ruthless empire. Now the ruler had to cast off the mask of a savage. For this ritual, the monarch arrives at the estate of Mur to his most loyal comrade in arms, Jarl Rognvald. For 10 long years, a comb had not touched the king's hair. It had matted into a horrific shell, soaked in the salt of storms, the sweat of countless battles, and caked enemy blood. This shaggy mane inspired primal terror, serving as a living banner of destruction. In the halls of Jarl Rognvald, a symbolic act of the birth of a new power unfolds. The loyal commander personally washes his overlord's head, combs out the tangled locks, and takes a pair of shears in his hands. Beneath the layer of years-old filth emerges a thick, golden gleaming shock of hair. It is precisely at this moment that an astonished Rognvald gives his suzerain the nickname with which he will enter world history, Harald Fairhair. The monster had vanished. Before the country stood a resplendent, civilized monarch. Having changed his appearance, Harald sets about redrawing the very essence of Scandinavian society with frightening methodology. Military campaigns give way to dry, ruthless bureaucracy. All along the western coast, royal residences sprout up like mushrooms, fortified estates where the treasury is now kept, and guardsmen spend the winter. The king permanently annihilates the ancient democracy of the north. He grinds the sacred right of the odal, the inalienable hereditary holding, into dust. From now on, every span of arable land, every forest stream and mountain meadow is declared the exclusive property of the crown. The free bondies wake up overnight as disenfranchised tenant farmers obligated to pay a harsh land tax. To maintain this massive tax collection machine, Harald builds an iron vertical of administration. The monarch hands control of every conquered province over to a trusted jarl. The viceroy keeps a third of the collected taxes for himself, in exchange pledging to maintain a private army and immediately suppress any hotbeds of discontent. Below the jarls stand the hursars, lower-ranking officers, each of whom receives a fixed salary and is ready to field 24 armed fighters at the first call. Harald sincerely believed that he was forging a great, prosperous power. It seemed to him that the brutal imposition of law would forever rid the fjords of tribal enmity, turning Norway into a mighty state equal to the empires of the south. But reality turned into suffocation. For the proud Northmen, whose ancestors had for centuries known no masters over them, the ensuing peace proved more terrifying than any war. A ringing silence reigned over the fjords, but it resembled the quiet of a prison cell. People who were accustomed to dissolving disputes at the open thing now silently handed over their last reserves of grain and silver to armed tax collectors. The man who dreamed of forging the perfect kingdom had erected the perfect dungeon. The country, shackled in the chains of taxation, stood frozen, but breaking the spirit of the free seafarers proved much harder than smashing their longships. Far from everyone accepted the humiliating fate of tribute payers. The boldest, wealthiest, and irreconcilable chieftains begin to secretly prepare their ships for departure. Very soon it will become clear to you how Harald's resplendent triumph provoked the most massive demographic catastrophe in Scandinavia. You will see why the king's cruelty forced the flower of the nation to head out to meet the icy storms of Iceland, and how the blood son of that very Jarl Rognvald, who had cut the monarch's hair, will transform into the most dangerous exile in Europe, redrawing the map of the world and founding invincible Normandy. King Harald Fairhair celebrated a total victory. Having seized power over the coast and established a network of royal residences, He sincerely believed he had secured an era of prosperity for Norway. The iron grip of taxation and the new administration were supposed to forge the tribal chaos into a monolithic state. But reality shattered these plans from an unexpected direction. The proud Scandinavian chieftains, who for centuries had known no masters, refused to become submissive tenant farmers on their own lands. Being stripped of the sacred right of the odal meant more to them than just financial ruin. It erased their very dignity and stripped them of their status as free men. Rather than pay a humiliating tribute for fields watered by the blood of their ancestors, they chose the ocean. Thus began the Great Exodus, a massive migration that forever changed the face of Northern Europe. At that time, it wasn't pathetic handfuls of criminals or vagabonds leaving their native shores. The flower of the nation, the wealthiest landowners, brilliant navigators, and renowned veterans of Hafrsfjord hastily loaded their families, slaves, and livestock onto heavy knars. Hundreds of oak ships sailed out into the stormy unknown. It looked like the evacuation of an entire state in the face of a deadly epidemic. The people preferred to face the icy hell of the North Atlantic just to avoid seeing the armed tax collectors of Norway's Unify. It was exactly this mass exodus that triggered the mechanism of global colonization. The exiles rushed to meet the western winds, rapidly settling the lifeless expanses of Iceland, the Faroe, Shetland, and Orkney Islands. If you haven't seen them, check out the fascinating and dramatic adventures of them and their descendants in our past series, Viking Discoverers. But the most unexpected conflicts flared up right inside the monarch's inner circle. The story of the young giant Rollo is especially telling. He was the blood son of Jarl Ragnvald, that very same loyal comrade who first combed out the king's tangled locks at the Moor estate. It would seem all doors at court were open to the young man. However, his independent temper and refusal to submit to the harsh new laws made him an enemy of the state. Harald ruthlessly exiles the son of his best friend, depriving him of his homeland forever. Watch the story of his dramatic fate in our series on the birth of Normandy. The monarch believed that by tossing the defiant across the sea, he would finally cleanse the country of its rebellious spirit. In reality, the king had forged an army of perfect, highly motivated enemies with his own hands. The refugees who settled on the rocky shores of the Orkney and Shetland Islands did not forget the insults they had suffered. Having established themselves on new, barren lands, the peaceful bondies of yesterday became ruthless naval pirates. With the onset of summer, their flotillas crossed the North Sea and crashed down upon the coast of Norway. They methodically plundered Harald's own domains, turning life in his perfect state into a constant nightmare. A paradoxical situation arose. The man who united the country to end internal banditry provoked a never-ending guerrilla war on his own shores. The conqueror was forced to go on the defensive. Harald's patience snapped. The king gathered a colossal armada and personally led it to the west. The campaign instantly escalated into a total purge of an entire archipelago. Norwegian longships mercilessly destroyed the rebel bases on the Shetland, Orkney, and Hebrides Islands, burning the settlements of the Avengers to the ground. The monarch did not stop at blind revenge. He officially annexed these lands, incorporating them into his growing empire and handing them over to the strict administration of loyal jarls. The ring of absolute power had snapped shut completely. Harald suppressed the external threats and silenced the internal critics. The surviving exiles, such as the mighty Rollo, were forced to seek new targets even further south. Soon, this rejected Norwegian would make France tremble, receive lands at the mouth of the Seine from King Charles the Simple, and lay the foundation for the Great Duchy of Normandy. The descendants of those whom Harald deprived of a home would in the future redraw the political map of Europe and conquer the English throne. The external enemies were crushed or scattered across the world. A deafening silence of harsh dictatorship hung over Norway. The aging monarch enjoyed the peace, sincerely believing that with his ironclad laws he had secured a millennium of prosperity for his dynasty. His treasury burst with silver, and his borders were guarded by devoted viceroys. But behind the ceremonial facade hid one fatal detail. Numerous marriages gave the king dozens of sons, in whose veins pulsed the same cruel, uncompromising blood. The ruler did not yet realize that the seeds of the most terrifying, exterminating chaos had sprouted inside his own home. And when these heirs take up arms, they will tear his carefully nurtured empire to bloody pieces. The beginning of the 10th century. The aging monarch surveys his conquered domains from the height of his throne. The war for the unification of Norway is long over, and the obstinate jarls are either dead or serving the crown by collecting tribute. But the silence hanging over the fjords is deceptive. The main threat to the state is brewing not across the sea, but in the very bedrooms of the king. Polygamy was the norm for the Scandinavian nobility, but Harald took this custom to unprecedented scales. Chronicles mention a multitude of the monarch's wives and concubines, from commoners to the daughters of neighboring konungs. The result of these unions was staggering. The names of nearly 20 of his sons have reached us. As the ruler grew old, this army of ambitious princes grew into men. In their veins boiled the same blood that had once pushed their father to conquer the country. They had no desire to sit in the shadows and merely be wealthy heirs. The sons began to openly terrorize their father's viceroys, forcefully seizing lands and tribute. To save his life's work from collapse, Harald takes a step that defies the logic of an empire builder. He decides to divide Norway. The monarch allocates a fiefdom to each of his sons, grants them the titles of konungs, and gives them the right to keep half of the taxes they collect. But over this entire brood of independent princes, he installs a supreme ruler, his favorite son, Erik, born of the Danish princess Ragnhild. It is exactly here that the dictator's fundamental mistake lies. Harald sincerely believed that handing out royal titles and generous incomes would satisfy his heirs' pride and preserve the monolithic nature of Norway. In reality, he single-handedly handed each of them the resources for a future civil war. The irony of fate is absolute. A man who spent decades mercilessly destroying petty konungs to forge a unified country, on his deathbed personally fragmented it, giving birth to 24 new monarchs, all hungry for absolute power. The system collapsed before the body of its creator had even grown cold. Sensing the weakening grip of the elderly father, the brothers locked into a deadly struggle for territory. The supreme heir, Erik, did not wait for the opposition to grow strong. Justifying his nickname, a blood axe, he began to methodically and ruthlessly slaughter his half-brothers, clearing the political field. Around the year 930, Harald Fairhair dies. He passes into oblivion undefeated. but he leaves behind not a prosperous power, but a seething cauldron of mutual hatred. The throne falls to a monster. The tyranny of Erik Bloodaxe would prove so unbearable that soon the Norwegians themselves would rise up against him, forcing the king to flee to England, and they would call to the throne another, younger son of Harald, Håkon the Good, who had been raised in the Christian tradition. Thus ended the era of the first Norwegian dictator in infamy. Harald Fairhair kept his youthful vow. He truly subjugated the defiant fjords, shattered the centuries-old foundations of ancient northern democracy, and shackled free men in the iron chains of unprecedented land taxes. But the historical process measures greatness not only by captured hectares, but by long-term consequences. In attempting to forge a perfect, submissive empire, Harald achieved the exact opposite effect. His cruelty spilled a colossal, uncontrollable energy beyond the borders of Scandinavia. Fleeing punitive detachments and the oppression of taxation, the flower of the nation threw themselves into the stormy ocean. It was his policies that provoked the Great Exodus, as a result of which refugees discovered and settled Iceland, and exiles redrew the map of continental Europe, laying the foundation for the mighty Duchy of Normandy. A state built exclusively on fear, the abolition of personal freedoms, and total confiscations inevitably births its own gravediggers. By compressing the spring of popular discontent, a tyrant always risks taking a blow that will ultimately tear his own dynasty apart from the inside. Here we leave the blood-drenched, smoke-choked shores of Norway. However, the chronicle of the Great Exodus does not end here. Far from everyone bowed their heads to the bloody unifier. In the next episode, we will turn to the destinies of those who preferred the icy unknown of the ocean to a warm royal collar. You will learn the story of the powerful chieftain Ketil Flatnose, who flat-out refused to submit to Harald and led his clan to the shores of Scotland. And, what is even more important, we will follow the fate of his incredible daughter, Aud the Deep-Minded. Having lost her husband and son in endless wars, this woman refused to surrender. She secretly built a ship, gathered loyal men, and set sail to Iceland to raise a society on bare rocks where there would never be kings again. The episode, Ketil Flatnose and Aud the Deep-Minded, The Price of Freedom, awaits you. This is a story about how exiles build new worlds, while sarcastic tyrants rot in their burial mounds. Subscribe so you don't miss the departure.